Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today I'm going to be talking about Dungeons & Dragons leadership and Dungeons & Dragons leadership, player character leadership, understood through the leadership lessons of the movie Green Room, which I think is a 2017 film, maybe 2016. But Green Room is a horror movie by A24. A24's absolutely spectacular, almost art house studio for they make what I call highbrow horror, and it's really a fantastic film. The Green Room is a fantastic horror movie by A24. I highly recommend it for any horror fans out there. And specifically, the movie is about a punk rock band that is making their way across the country, stopping to do shows. They are not doing well. They're having a really hard time finding people that like their music, just going from town to town, having enough money to keep moving in their van with their sound equipment and do their shows. And essentially they have a bad gig. They're really out of money. And the promoter feels really bad about the bad gig. And he says, listen, I can get you a real paying gig, but the people I'm going to go that you're going to play for, they're pretty hardcore. Don't talk about politics. You'll get paid $350, which for them is a lot, which is kind of sad that that's a lot for for a gig. But and so so basically at this point he sends them to this place where they can play their punk rock music, and they realize that these people are actually Nazi sympathizers and are white supremacists, right? So they're playing this show, and they decide it'd be a good idea to say to actually insult the white supremacists in their own area, in their own owned bar, right? And so things go south, and essentially the punk rock band witnesses a murder. The white supremacists are, oh, by the way, spoilers. The white supremacists are majorly into selling drugs, and they are actually quite militant. They're one of the best lines of the film is Patrick Stewart is in this movie, and he plays the leader of the Nazi sympathizers, American Nazi sympathizers. And he says, "This, remember, this isn't a party. This is a movement, right?" So these people are hardcore. One of the things that the film does a fantastic job of just kind of showing, the depths of horror that would exist in a group like this, in a white supremacist group, right? And Patrick Stewart is really the anchor of this film. But the film is about these punk rockers who end up in the wrong place and are caught in a green room, and they're caught in this fortified bar that these Nazi sympathizers own, and they have to escape, right, or be killed. So they're either going to get out of the building and be able to run away from the building, or they're going to die in the building, because what they've witnessed, the Nazi sympathizers cannot allow them to leave with that information, all right? Now, there's a section in here that talks about leadership. So one of the things is, one of the guys, the punk rock protagonist, right, he gets horribly injured when he puts his hand out of a door in order to do kind of a hand-to-hand, in order to do an exchange with the Nazi sympathizers while his punk rock group is in the green room, right? His hand gets slashed to pieces, and they're bandaging his hand. They pull his hand back into the room, and his entire arm is just shredded. It looks like beefaroni. It's terrible, right? So they're going to repair his arm with duct tape, okay? And so basically they're repairing his arm, and this punk rock protagonist looks around. There's two groups. There's his punk rock band, and there's another punk rock band in the room, right? And so now they're just taping up his arm, and he realizes they are really, really in a terrible situation, and they need leadership. And so he starts telling a story about paintball, and he says, "You know what, everybody? We need to do this Randy paintball style." So he starts telling this story about another member of the band who used to be with his band but isn't with the band now, and how his punk rock band played this group of ex-Marines in paintball. And these ex-Marines, knew hand signals. They had good aiming skills. they actually knew the business of war, right? And they were just wrecking their paintball crew, right? Well, they reroute, they kind of rallied and got to a point where they, another game started, and Randy said, "Listen, we can't beat these guys at doing real war, right? We can't do it with their style because they're going to beat us. We have to pretend to be what we have to pretend to be warriors in the way that we know, right? And we need to own it and live it, right, in a pretend way, right? And now, here's the thing. The punk rock protagonist gets halfway through this story, but he's interrupted, and he's not able to tell the rest of the story until later in the movie, okay? So he tells half the story, and then one of the punk rock band members, his own band member, says, "All right, we got to get into action," and cuts off his story. Now, what was happening was punk rock protagonist, right? And then punk rock secondary band member, right? Punk rock secondary band member will not listen to the leadership that is being given to him through a narrative, right? But the punk rock protagonist understood that in that time, with their backs to the wall, that group needed leadership, right? But one of the things the film shows very clearly is that leadership has two parts. It has a few different parts. You need somebody who is wise. You need somebody who has experience. You need somebody who's going to share that wisdom and experience. But in addition to that, you need people who will listen. If the group won't listen, then that group can't be led, right? And I thought that was, I'd never seen it more clearly shown and more elegantly shown than in the movie Green Room, all right? And it was saying leadership has two parts. You need a person who's willing to lead with a narrative, right? And you need somebody who's going to listen to that narrative and put it into effect, right? And this punk rock secondary band member would not hear the full story out. Of course, he is, and he rushes everybody into action with no plan. And more than half the punk rock, in fact, everybody but the punk rock protagonist and one second band member, member from a different band than the main protagonist. So everybody gets killed except the punk rock protagonist and the second band member, right? Now the second band member later, when they've gone through another round of terror and they're dealing with all kinds of problems, she actually sits down and says to the punk rock protagonist, says, "Tell me the story you were going to tell earlier," right? And he's like, "Well, what's it matter now? Everybody's dead. It's just a waste of breath." And she says, "No, tell me the story. I want to hear it," right? So you had somebody who was able to lead, and you had somebody who was able to listen to leadership. And the two of them are able to actually execute exactly the story from the narrative and are able to escape with their lives and are even able to get enough weapons to exact revenge on the people who killed all of their other band members, which was pretty incredible, right? So, one, there's the lesson on leadership, right? You need somebody who's going to lead, and you need somebody who's going to listen, right? Now, what does this mean fully in a D&D context, right? So one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is we have a major, major problem within Dungeons & Dragons about leadership. So one, it's treated like a skill like any other, and it's not extremely well executed in the game. And the reason why is generally Dungeons & Dragons games are incredibly geared toward not having a leader for the party, right? And there's absolutely no loss of performance for a Dungeons & Dragons warband, a group of adventurers, if they don't have leadership. In fact, the Dungeons & Dragons game, in my opinion, clearly gives extremely little, if gives negligible or no benefit to having leadership within an adventuring party. Now, I think this is a very specific choice, right? And I'm going to remind everybody, okay, so what I'm about to say now should absolutely not apply to your first 5 years of play, right? Have fun, play your Dungeons and Dragons game. Really play a lot of poor Dungeons and Dragons until you've seen the fun of the game, seen the shape of the game. But all right, here's the thing: at higher levels of play, when you're an advanced skilled dungeon master and you have advanced skilled players at your table, right? You can start to look at leadership from another perspective. And actually, one of the things I'm thinking about is for Dungeons & Dragons 6th edition, they might want to think about this. I think the game needs structure to allow leadership to matter more. Because in real life, so Dungeons & Dragons, to some extent, is trying to emulate certain aspects of real life. And I think leadership would be worth emulating and learning more about and incorporating better into Dungeons & Dragons. And here's how you would do it, right? So, one, you would give incentives, you would give mechanical benefits to having a leader within the group, okay? Now, the problem with this is you need players who are willing to listen to the lead player, right? So you'll need a player leader, a player character leader. Actually, you'll need a player leader, and you'll need player followers. That's tough because people don't want to follow, right? But I think that leadership is so important, and there's so many lessons to be learned within Dungeons & Dragons that we need to adjust Dungeons & Dragons so that it can fit leadership better. Here's how you would do it. You need to give benefits to incorporating leadership within the play style of the player character group, and then you need to give incentives for the people who are actually listening to leadership, right? So there needs to be distinct mechanical benefits. The other thing is, I think we need to really realize it, and I do think it's worth going down to, I know there's this huge debate on whether Dungeons & Dragons is a real world simulation. Well, one of the things is we as players really, really, really are very crazily dedicated to realism when it comes to weapons, but we're not dedicated to realism when it comes to things like leadership, right? So I think it would be really good to bring this focus into the game, right? And what you would do, I think the way you would do it is, one, anyone who is the best possible at combat within the group immediately recedes to the follower, to the follower role. That player, if you're the best in the group at combat, the better you are at combat, the farther you should be from the leadership role, right? And the reason why is time is the true currency of life, and player characters are under the same restrictions as real world people, right? So if you are incredibly good at sword and board, if you are incredibly good at casting spells, combat spells, that means you didn't have the time to learn to read and write well. You didn't have the time to learn social graces. You didn't have the time to learn appraisal. You didn't have the time to learn, navigating. You didn't have the time to read subtle clues. And the reason why is you keep swinging that sword. You keep putting that, that shield up. Combat is incredibly powerful within Dungeons & Dragons for winning combat, but it is so limited in every other way. It really stops that character from being a viable candidate for leadership within the game, right? Now, ideally, as players could implement this without any change in Dungeons & Dragons 6th edition. Players could say, listen, we're going to have a leader, we're going to follow that leader, and a good dungeon master could reward that, right? And the structure for this would be, the better you are at combat, the farther you should be removed from leadership, right? And then the characters that have more skills and more versatility should be the ones who are going to provide leadership, right? And so I think that's the structure. And how do we get there? There's a couple ways. We can implement this as players and dungeon masters in our games now, right? Dungeon masters have the freedom to build mechanical benefits for having a leader within the player character party, and for the players who are listening to leadership, right? And then second, you have you could put it into Dungeons & Dragons 6th edition, which I think is very much worth it. I would love to see that change made to Dungeons & Dragons 6th edition. That's my take on how leadership should be processed within the game. I'd love to hear what you think. Please consider liking and subscribing. Thank you.